Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 18th of February, 2026, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to the UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me by video link today are Charles Malet and Vanessa Beeley. Now, later in the programme, Charles is going to be reporting on the risks caused by the lithium battery industry, and we'll have an update on the sentencing of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. Vanessa is going to be covering the Iran focus at the Munich Security Conference and Russia's involvement in Gaza reconstruction, and I'll have an update on the fallout from Discord's decision to roll out age verification globally, and also taking a look at paramilitary protection rackets in Northern Ireland. But we're going to begin today with vaccine injuries because according to the BBC, and they're really calling this as a bit of an exclusive, the NHS has paid almost £40 million of taxpayers' money to a company called Crawford and Company Adjusters. Now, this is a US-owned outsourcing firm which has been contracted by the UK government to assess claims of harm caused by COVID vaccines. That number, 50 million, I think it's 48 million in total, is 8 times the original estimate for the work. So it was originally supposed to be £6 million. Now, Crawford was brought on in March 2022 to carry out medical assessments for the UK-wide vaccine damage payment scheme, which offers a one-off tax-free payment of £120,000 to those that can prove vaccine caused them severe disability. But if we bring that back on screen here, then it goes on to say that the firm's 5-year contract, as I say, initially valued at £6 million, but costs spiraled dramatically as the volume of claims far exceeded expectations. And so this is what they said. Volume of claims has exceeded the anticipated levels. At its peak, the NHS was paying Crawford £5.9 million in a single month. And of course, that was almost the entire contract value. Now, 22,000 claims related to COVID vaccine damage had been submitted, the vast majority apparently linked to the AstraZeneca jab. Only around 1% of those have resulted in compensation payouts. And as of November last year, 249 people had received payments, and that was totaling £29.8 million. So in other words, £20 million less than had been paid to Crawford for running the assessments. Now, the BBC article is clearly an effort to whitewash the situation. They quote legal experts who've raised serious questions, as they describe it, about how the contract was structured. And they quote someone called Albert Sanchez-Grills, a professor at University of Bristol Law School, who said that the contract was peculiar and given the uncertainty at the time. And I'm going to ask, well, what uncertainty? Because everybody was fairly certain that there was going to be problems with these jabs as they were rolled out. But anyway, he also argued that a shorter agreement with a cap on the number of claims processed would have been more appropriate. So let's not worry about how many people are actually affected by this. Put a cap on it anyway. And he said that using firm contracts in uncertain situations carries significant commercial risks. So this is all about commerce and all about the profitability of various things, but not really about the impact on individual people's lives. Now, the NHS has now got rid of this company and is looking for a new provider. Now, apparently that new provider has been chosen, and that's this lot, Maximus. So it's going to be, this contract's taken over by Maximus UK Services Limited. Now, this is another US headquartered company, and their new 5-year contract is estimated at £27 million. That, of course, is considerably more than the £6 million in the original assessment. And then the vaccine injury scheme are, of course, as everybody knows, is under review by Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary at the moment. And there's going to be more propaganda on this coming out from the COVID inquiry in the not too distant future as they attempt to whitewash the damage that was done. Charles, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, because clearly they were expecting there to be many fewer people coming forward to highlight problems that they've experienced than there have been. And of course, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, no matter what academics might be saying or what the BBC might be saying, because it was pretty clear very early on that people were being injured by these things.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mike, and good afternoon, all. Yes, I mean, I think the level of cynicism here is absolutely outrageous, and of course, this is not a new issue, as was highlighted right at the start of there being a vaccine damage scheme. It was like wading through treacle, but also the sort of adding insult to serious injury. This idea that you had to be able to qualify to what degree you had been affected in order to be able to qualify for the payment. So the reluctance with which government is actually progressing this is absolutely unbelievable. Of course, no great surprise to see that the amounts of money being given to corporations absolutely dwarf that which would go to those who've been affected. And I think the only other point to make, I mean, it's hardly a positive, but the fact that this does actually bring the issue of what went wrong and why back into the public's consciousness. So it can only be hoped that in reporting on it, like we do here at UK Column, that people are made aware in a way that they perhaps have been inclined to forget about over the last few years.
Yes, thank you for that, Charles. Now, on Monday's program, Ben was talking about, and Ben Brown, we're talking about Rupert Lowe. This is related in a certain sense.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I mean, I think really by coincidence, Ben's point in terms of his reporting of Rupert Lowe's announcement that Restore Britain will now become a political party was really he now, and indeed his organisation, deserves a level of scrutiny that he'd not been hitherto subjected to. And is he and is Restore Britain what it purports to be? Now, interestingly, we continue on the theme of vaccine damage, because here he is tweeting back in November 2024. If we can just pop that on screen now, the Department of Health has revealed that there have been nearly 500,000 adverse reaction reports, highlighted or underlined there. He then goes on to say forcing the vaccine on millions who had no need for it was entirely wrong. I mean, one might adjust that to forcing the vaccine on anyone was entirely wrong. Now, he's put out a series of tweets about this in recent weeks, going back to 13th of January. Britain needs a full inquiry into both COVID vaccine harms and also the wider health impact inflicted on the British people through lockdown measures and so forth. So he's very much setting out a case there for being against the authoritarian, tyrannical, corrupt measures that were put in place from 2020 onwards. How what we must consider now is how do his own dealings stack up with that point of view? So we go to the Register of Interests in the on the Parliament website, and lo and behold, we see that he is a director of something called PE487 Limited, concerned with freeze drying pharma related business. Now, what is this? It is an entity called Biopharma Process Systems Limited, and here he is shown as a director of this organization, which he has been since 2009. And one of the standard industrial classifications for this organization is research and experimental development on biotechnology. Well, what exactly does that mean? And we go to their website, Biopharma Group, and we find an article, or at least a web page entitled The Importance and Challenges of mRNA Vaccines and How the Correct Fill and Finish Equipment Can Support Your mRNA Ambitions. We'll look at a little bit of a text from this page, which says mRNA vaccinology is advantageous because it offers adaptability in both the number and type of antigenic determinants, and its versatility means that mRNA can be described as an attractive source of antigen, and the nature of mRNA leads to different advantageous benefits. And I'm not suggesting that Rupert Lowe wrote this, but nonetheless, he has been a director of this organization for more than 15 years, and indeed, he is in receipt of money from it. Quite clearly, a facilitator in mRNA vaccine technology, which was at the heart of the problems with the COVID so called vaccine. Now, one might consider that this is a one-off, but if we look further down the register of interests, we see that that's not actually the case. And indeed, he also has a shareholding in what's called Bluebird Holdings Limited. Now, this is an Ethiopian investment company that oversees 54 Capital. And in our history, we see that they have invested into Addis Pharmaceutical Factory, Ethiopia's largest pharmaceutical drug provider. Now, I'm not suggesting they've had anything to do with the COVID vaccines, but nonetheless, there is a pattern here, as identified or at least explained by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, very much using the same MO as the likes of Bill Gates here, listed as it is 54 Capital in the investment opportunities in vaccine and essential medicines manufacturing in parts of the world that are in effect susceptible to the influence of Western organizations, suggesting that they need to have certain medical products in order to treat conditions that they may or may not have. Now, I got in touch with Restore Britain to ask for a clarification on Rupert Lowe's position on this, because there does appear to be a significant conflict between what he says and what he does. And interestingly, the automatic response said, if appropriate, a member of our team will be in touch. Well, so far it has not been appropriate to respond on the specific issue of mRNA vaccines. So I just close out by saying that it might also be of interest to note that when he was calling for the death penalty back in November of 2025, this coincided exactly with the Israeli parliament doing the same thing, about which I wrote in the previous edition of the Blindfold Briefing, a capital coincidence, which I would invite you to have a read of.
Thank you very much for that, Charles. Thanks for that. We'll talk more about this in extra, I have no doubt. Vanessa, let me welcome you to the program now. And as we discussed, or we mentioned on Friday, Munich Security Conference going on over the weekend. And a lot of the focus seems to have been on Iran.
Yeah, very much so. Building the narrative for regime change war. Now, first of all, I just want to look at the 4 points that Netanyahu said he discussed with President Trump in Washington. This is Netanyahu speaking at the Jerusalem conference after his visit to Washington, but it gives a very good insight as to what the US negotiations will base their requirements upon. So let's just play this.
Several components that we believe are important not only for the security of Israel, but for the security of the world. The United States, the region, the world. The first is that all enriched material has to leave Iran. The second is that there shall be no enrichment capability, not stopping the enrichment process, but dismantle the equipment and the infrastructure that allows you to enrich in the first place. And the third is to deal also with the questions of ballistic missiles. There's an MTCR limitation of 300 kilometers, and Iran is supposed to adhere to it. Of course it doesn't, as the Rising Lion operation by itself manifested. Everybody knows that. And the fourth is dismantle the axis of terror that Iran has built. It's been smashed, but it's still there. It's trying to recover, as Iran itself is trying to do.
So, I mean, basically, of course, Netanyahu is bringing forward terms that Iran is under no circumstances going to accept. So we see the usual negotiations trap being set. Then Netanyahu mentions that Iran lies or makes stuff up, is a deceitful enemy, etc. But let's listen to what he says about the disarmament of Hamas in Gaza.
And then Gaza must be demilitarized. Disarmed means that it must give up its weapons, not main weapons. And what are the main? People said heavy weapons. There are practically no heavy weapons in Gaza. There's no artillery, there are no tanks. There's nothing. The heavy weapon, the one that does the most damage, is called an AK-47. Okay? That's it. That's how they execute people.
So wait, did Netanyahu just admit that the Palestinians had absolutely nothing to do with the massacres on October the 7th, which released scenes like this, where cars had been torched by Apache helicopters, tanks, and so on, under the control of the Israelis? And of course, this is kind of a foregone conclusion. Even Hebrew media sources like Haaretz have very clearly stated that the IDF ordered the Hannibal Directive on October the 7th to prevent Hamas taking soldiers captive. So just an aside from the Iran issue, but demonstrating the hypocrisy of Israel when they claim that Iran is the one that is lying. And then let's come to the Munich Security Conference, as you mentioned, Mike. And if you just scroll down a search on YouTube for the Munich Conference and Iran, you get a whole raft of such interviews and talks, of course, all targeting Iran for regime change. And the dreadful Lindsey Graham was there, who's been given increased relevance under the Trump administration. And here he is talking to Christiane Amanpour at the Munich conference.
Ever problems associated with the day after, if the people win against the Ayatollah, are a fraction of the problems associated with the Ayatollah killing his way out yet again, standing to murder another day. If you don't realize we're on the verge of history, you're missing a lot. We're talking weeks, not months. And when we do this, if we do, we're starting and we're not stopping.
What I find interesting is what he basically says is we'll secure a regime change after that. We really don't care what happens in Iran. But again, they're working on behalf of the Iranian people. Then shortly after the Munich Security Conference, Lindsey Graham went to Tel Aviv, where he again pushed the regime change message to an Israeli audience. Let's hear this.
The best answer to all the problems created by Iran is regime change. The best answer is for the people to take the place of the Ayatollah. I do not believe they're in the streets to build more nuclear weapons. I think they're in the streets to have a better life.
So, I mean, there's absolutely no sort of subterfuge over this particular regime change operation. Then, of course, last night or yesterday, we had the talks in Geneva, the second round of talks. They're heading for a third round of talks. Apparently, the Iranian foreign minister had actually said that there was some agreement on guiding principles. Generally, the response has been positive. Of course, generally speaking, Iranians believe that negotiation is always a trap and that there is absolutely no chance of concessions from Iran towards what Israel is demanding. At the same time, Trump is building up a military presence in the region. They're sending the USS Abraham Lincoln to join the other aircraft carriers. And there have been reports of dozens of planes, F-22, 35 and 16, heading towards US bases in the region. And finally, I think Mike and everyone listening today will agree with me that the clearest sign of the US heading for a regime change war or destabilization project is when they Hitlerize the enemy. And this is exactly what Lindsey Graham does at the end of his conversation with Christiane Amanpour at the Munich Security Conference. So let's just play this.
All we need is the courage of our convictions. I cannot promise you exactly what the day after will be. But if somebody had killed Hitler in 1935, it would have probably been better. If this regime falls, the day after has promise. If it stays in place, the day after is going to generationally destroy the Mideast, and we'll be haunted by this for generations to come, and they will be talking about us in a very bad way.
So I think the end game is inevitable. It's just how long it takes for the US to get to that point.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Vanessa. Thank you for that. Now let's move on to online safety issues then. And sorry, before we do that, we'll just have a quick ad break just to say to everybody, if you like what the UK column does and you would like to support us, please head over to the website. The options for helping us out are there, and your support absolutely needed on an ongoing basis. So thank you very much to everybody that is contributing financially. If you can't help us financially, please do share this program, any other program that we're producing that you like, because that helps us beat the censorship regime that we're going to talk a little bit more about in a second. Tonight at 7, Michael Rechtenwald is speaking to Jerm on free speech and the death of academia. That's at 7 o'clock tonight. No Silicon Steel tonight. It's Chinese New Year, so join us hopefully on Friday. There'll be the next one. Now, let's come on to the censorship issue and the issue of online safety, because Discord, the global it's a chat platform and so on, they've decided to roll out globally their age verification system, and it has absolutely sparked a massive backlash because of privacy, data security, and also the concerns about the involvement of certain investors that we'll come on to in a second. Now, for those that don't know, Discord is a messaging community platform. It's got about 200 million users per month, many of whom are now leaving for alternatives. Now, Discord announced earlier this month that it would roll out its age assurance program globally from March. And this, of course, is building on what they're already doing in the UK and in Australia. And the move is described as being a child safety measure. Of course, we've been talking about this for quite some time. Now, under the new system, all users will default to a teen-appropriate experience with access to age-restricted servers, channels, and other settings locked unless a user can prove that they're an adult. They say that they will implement an age inference model. So this is a machine learning system, an AI system that draws on account usage, device type, activity platforms, and they're going to classify users into age groups without needing them to submit any documents or take a selfie, except when additional confirmation is required. They say that they will offer multiple privacy-forward options through trusted partners. They say that facial scans will never leave your device, and they say that they or their partners will never receive your data. They say that IDs are used to get your age only and then deleted. So actually you do have to provide IDs under certain circumstances. And they say that they only receive their age and that's all. And your identity is never associated with your account. Now, the problem for Discord is that last year, attackers accessed 70,000 users' government IDs, selfies, and other sensitive information. And that was after compromising Discord's third-party customer support system. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we see this on screen at the moment, has awarded Discord its We Still Told You So Breaches Award. Now, these are a bunch of awards that they give out every year for any breaches of data privacy and so on. And they're saying here, last year, Authentics won our first We Told You So award because we predicted in 2023 age verification mandates would inevitably lead to more data breaches, potentially exposing government IDs, as well as information about the sites that the user visits. Like clockwork, they did. It was our first We Told You So Breaches award, but we knew it wouldn't be the last. So Discord won the 2025 award. But things got worse for Discord when it emerged that they were not relying solely on KID, which was their primary global ID supplier, but was also experimenting with a second supplier. And that second supplier was this lot, Persona. They started carrying a disclaimer for UK users that information would be processed by an age assurance vendor called Persona, and that unlike the other situation, which would be on device, information submitted to Persona would temporarily be stored for up to 7 days on Persona's servers before deletion. Now, Persona's major investors, we just put Persona back on screen there for a second, William, please. Persona's major investors include this man, Peter Thiel, looking out from the side there. So all of this is yet another example of why age assurance being rolled out as a result of the Online Safety Act, of course, is nothing whatever to do with child safety or online safety. It is about de-anonymizing the internet and providing people like Peter Thiel with huge quantities of valuable data. In other words, humans are being farmed. And because, as I've been saying for a very long time now, age assurance does nothing to prevent adults posing as children on websites geared towards children, like Roblox. This is where most child grooming happens online. And these types of platforms are problematic. Now, this is recognized in other countries, and we're citing Egypt as an example here, and in fact, other Arab countries as well. But here, so in other words, so Egypt basically has banned Roblox in that country, and other Arab countries have done so as well. But here it's just data collection and data breaches. And of course, Substack is the latest. So earlier this month, they had to admit that in October last year, an unauthorized third-party accessed user data, including email addresses, phone numbers, and other unspecified internal metadata. And they said in a statement or in an email that they sent to customers, "I'm reaching out to let you know about a security incident that resulted in the email address and phone number from your Substack account being shared without your permission. I'm incredibly sorry that this has happened. We take our responsibility to protect your data and privacy seriously, and we came up short here." So, Charles, it has got to be said, it is time to push back extremely strongly against the Online Safety Act. Well, actually, the time was when it was still a bill, but saying it released should be, or sorry, saying it repealed should be at the top of our priority list, because this is a major part of the panopticon which is being built right out in the open.
It absolutely is. And I think it's astonishing given that we have these sorts of instances happening absolutely all the time. I mean, the preposterous claim that any of these platforms are in some way protected against such breaches is just ludicrous. But it should keep the Online Safety Act in the public eye. People should be applying exactly that sort of pressure to contest this sort of thing. And again, the suggestion that the answer to all of this is further digitization of everything, and that you should further submit your identity, all the critical data into these platforms is an absolute nonsense. And one can just hope that more and more people are beginning to see the direction that this is going in before it's too late.
Indeed. Okay, well, let's move international now. And first of all, to Hong Kong and the Jimmy Lai sentencing, Charles.
Yeah, although a different location. I mean, this very much follows what Vanessa's just been saying about Iran and, of course, the pressure from elsewhere for regime change. Now, here we have the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, responding to the Jimmy Lai sentencing. He's been sent down for 20 years, supposedly strengthening the pro-democracy stance in Hong Kong that was taken in 2019, or at least so the story goes. Now, what Yvette Cooper actually said in her statement, among other things, was British national Jimmy Lai was today sentenced to 20 years in prison in Hong Kong for exercising his right to freedom of expression following a politically motivated prosecution. Well, that's not very accurate from Yvette Cooper. That is not why he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And of course, British national he may be, but it's worth noting that he spent the first 12 years of his life in mainland China before his family moved to Hong Kong. She went on to say that Beijing's national security law was imposed on Hong Kong to silence China's critics. And again, she might want to take a look at the very similar National Security Act 2023 in the United Kingdom and examine exactly what the purpose of that is. And then she concludes by saying that we stand with the people of Hong Kong and will always honour the historical commitments made under the legally binding Sino-British Joint Declaration, and China must do the same. Now, we'll come back to that, but no great surprise to see that across the Atlantic, Marco Rubio has chucked out a sort of abbreviated version of exactly the same thing, saying it shows the world that Beijing will go to extraordinary lengths to silence those who advocate fundamental freedoms in Hong Kong, casting aside the international commitments Beijing made in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. So he's referring back to that again. Now, what I'd like to do is take a look at what Dr. Warwick Powell said to Carl Czar on a recent episode of the Silk and Steel podcast, because he deals with exactly this issue and shatters the myths that the likes of Yvette Cooper and Marco Rubio are putting out.
Jimmy Lai was part of an American destabilization / regime change frontline operation. And he was charged ultimately with sedition and for collusion with foreign powers. Now, I don't know whether it was collusion or not, because collusion kind of implies that it was done in secret. But when you're actually on a global stage calling for America to launch nuclear weapons on China, I'm not sure that that's collusion, right? It's certainly not the secret type of collusion. but he was charged under national security laws. Now, those national security laws were, of course, the subject of much controversy, and the Western press will talk about them as being pernicious and this and that. But of course, they're by and large mirrored on national security laws that you find in just about every other country in the world. And the other point to remember is that the national security laws passed by Hong Kong was actually part and parcel of the original agreement, right, with the British, that there would be national security laws. And so the implication these days is that somehow what mainland China is doing runs contrary to the agreements in the original handover. It's actually nonsense. There was always a requirement for national security laws to be passed. There was an attempt to do so in the early 2000s, and it failed in the face of orchestrated public protest. Eventually, they've succeeded. So Jimmy Lai gets charged. He's found guilty. Pretty hard to not find him guilty, frankly, given all of the publicly available evidence on top of the evidence that was presented in the court. And he was sentenced to 20 years. The West has gone absolutely apoplectic about this, right? But it's got nothing to do with free speech.
As indeed he says, it has nothing to do with free speech. And I think the important point that he makes there is about what was coming from the declaration signed in 1984 by the various administrations, by the United Kingdom and China. As we just have a look at some of the text here, which is explicit in stating that except for foreign and defence affairs, which are the responsibilities of the Central People's Government, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region shall be vested with executive, legislative and independent judicial power. So the point is that Cooper saying that this is Beijing, in effect, overstepping, this was absolutely set down in 1984 for handover in 1997, which makes her point disingenuous, to say the least. Now, on the subject of foreign influence, we can't really ignore the significant part that Mark Simon has played in all of this. Looking at his Twitter profile here, he described himself as a former executive at Apple Daily, which of course was the media organization that Jimmy Lai was ostensibly in charge of, admittedly something that was losing money at an extraordinary rate, given the amounts of money that were changing hands. And Simon might be regarded perhaps as Lai's handler. Now, this is well articulated by an article in the Global Times from China entitled "The Verdict Reveals Jimmy Lai's True Nature as a Foreign Agent." Now, what this article does very well is explains the various steps of what might be described as a colour revolution. It also points out that Simon was in receipt of payments, 86 payments that added up to 118 million Hong Kong dollars from Jimmy Lai, and the money here has come from a variety of sources, but most notably perhaps the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is something I've spoken about on this very program in the past. Now, the other thing to note that I would like to point out is, having just come back from Hong Kong, I have spoken directly to people who have felt the effect of what is absolutely disinformation promulgated by Apple Daily, and indeed people who have in effect been on the receiving end of this. So there is, going back to Warwick Powell's point, there is absolutely no doubt about the guilt and involvement of Lai in the first place. Now, how has the Western media responded to this? Well, perhaps best encapsulated by BBC Media Action, which has taken to LinkedIn to describe Jimmy Lai as now being added to the list of more than 300 journalists in prison around the world. Well, how consistent are they? Was BBC Media Action reporting on the very many arrests surrounding the prescription and very confused situation surrounding Palestine action at the moment, or indeed all the many detentions under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000? And all I would do is just close by saying, if you feel like you do need more background on this, then please go back to the UK Column News of the 20th of November 2024 to have a look at the background to the Jimmy Lai case going back to 2019, and indeed particularly the heavy hand that the National Endowment for Democracy, among others, has played in this. Now, Mike, I'm sure you've got some comment to make on exactly this and the sort of specific intent that the Western powers have to try to destabilize China through this sort of psychological operation.
Yeah, but not just China. It's so many countries, and BBC Media Action, Thomson Reuters Foundation as well, both in receipt of foreign Commonwealth and Development Office money in order to pursue regime change operations in other countries. So what do? They carry out media training. They carry out so-called counter disinformation programs. They identify opposition voices and they amplify those opposition voices, and they use those opposition voices, should it get to the actual regime change point, to be representatives of so-called grassroots thought and feeling in those countries back to the British media and the Western media in return. And we can talk much more about this in extra, but it is I understand that there are opposition voices in these countries, but they've got to be very, very careful about getting involved with these types of players, because there's big money involved in it, and big efforts at influence campaigns, and it's much bigger than perhaps some people think it is.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a critical point to make. When we go back to 2019, exactly who was involved and playing what part, and how many of those people genuinely had any idea of where the influences were coming from and why it was that they were involved in the first place. And of course, then the behavior, the conduct of the security and intelligence forces in Hong Kong and how that was being orchestrated. But as you say, lots more to talk about in extra.
Yes, Vanessa, let's come back to you then. And well, obviously, over the last number of weeks, you've been talking about the Gaza reconstruction ideas from Trump and so on. But what has Russia's role been in all this?
Well, it's kind of interesting. It's quite a conundrum, in fact, because since Trump created his so-called Peace Board or Board of Peace, which has its inaugural convention tomorrow in Washington, there's been some confusion over whether Russia were actually to accept a place on the board. Initially, President Putin was talking about allocating $1 billion from the frozen $5 billion in assets in the US to be able to buy them a place on the board. Now there seems to be a slight different direction for the $1 billion. Dmitry Peskov went on record yesterday saying Russia remains the only country in the world that has decided to allocate $1 billion in aid to the Palestinians. Now, this isn't entirely true that they are the only country, and we'll come on to this. But let's just have a look at Gaza before and Gaza as it is now. This is just one section of Gaza City, that at least a minimum of $70 billion is needed to even get it back to the condition that it was in previously. And of course, Israel is continuing the genocide in Gaza itself. It's not providing humanitarian aid. Children are dying of cold and starvation, etc., while in the West Bank, and I'll come on to that, things are ramping up to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, even from the West Bank enclaves. Now, 4 months ago, even the Saudi foreign minister was making the point that while they're ready to contribute to the reconstruction in Gaza, they did actually say it is unacceptable to seek international funding to rebuild Gaza while the underlying conditions that enabled its destruction remain unchanged. Now, this is the first that I agree with Saudi Arabia, but in contrast to the Russians that are simply putting out a statement saying, yeah, we'll give $1 billion for reconstruction without any conditions as to how that money will be used and what conditions the Palestinians are going to be living in post-reconstruction. And then, of course, back on the 22nd of January, President Putin, again, this is where some of the confusion comes in. He met with Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority in Moscow at the Kremlin. If we can just have this on screen, please, that would be great. Where he was actually saying that the $1 billion would be a contribution to Trump's Board of Peace. Now, while having conversations with Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, of course, there must be recognition that the Palestinian Authority is considered effectively to be a stooge of Israel and is largely responsible for much of the repression of the resistance in the West Bank in particular. And then in the last 2 days, the deputy foreign minister put out a statement saying that basically Russia is still trying to nail down the Board of Peace mission. Apparently, Minsk suggested to Moscow that they could represent Russia on the Board of Peace. That was knocked aside by Sergei Rybakov, who, as I said, is the deputy foreign minister. And in fact, what he said is Moscow is in no hurry to decide. We will see who takes part in Washington on February the 19th, at which level and scope. We continue to study, to analyze the set of proposals and elements concerning the structures, function, and scope. So again, we're left in rather a state of limbo as to whether Russia is officially going to be involved in the Board of Peace. Many European countries are backing off from it, saying that Trump is trying to effectively replace the UN and take control not only of the peace process in Palestine, but in other areas of the world. And at the same time, as I mentioned, the ramping up of pressure on the West Bank itself. So Israel's new West Bank registration process is basically declaring Palestinian land in the West Bank as state property, which of course effectively is annexation of that land. Now, just for people to understand the extent of loss of territory for the Palestinians, here's a map just showing Gaza there on the left and what's left of the West Bank, which of course, if we look at the next slide, we can see to what degree that has also been broken down and divided. If we could thank you. So basically you have Area A, which is run by the Palestinian Authority, Area B, which is 22% of the territory, PA and Israel, and then Area C, which is being targeted for this annexation of land and making of this land to be state property, effectively will lose through that process 83% of that area. So when you look at the orange area, 83% of that will then be annexed to Israel, to the state. And of course, it will not be resold to Palestinians. And at the same time, Israel is bringing in tanks, it's bringing in aerial bombing, helicopters into the West Bank in an attempt to further ethnically displace or ethnically cleanse the people from the West Bank in a very similar fashion that was used in Gaza. And in fact, these are figures relating to May 2025. So now, of course, they've obviously increased. I think around 7,000 Palestinians have been driven out of their homes in the West Bank, and something like probably more than 3,000 Palestinian-owned structures in the West Bank have effectively been destroyed. And all of this while Russia, of course, traditionally, and China talk about or uphold a two-state solution. Well, one has to ask what kind of two-state solution is going to exist if all Palestinian territory is effectively annexed and the Palestinians are ethnically cleansed from their homes in both Gaza and in the West Bank. And of course, there's no statement from Russia on this basis. And then I just want to raise the question, who is going to receive this 1 billion of reconstruction aid for Gaza? Is it going to go to the Palestinian Authority, which is effectively Israel? Is it going to go directly to Israel, whom we know has no intention of allowing Palestinians to remain in Gaza except as cheap labor contained within even smaller labor camps to effectively secure Gaza as part of a free trade zone running in the India-Middle East Economic Corridor from India through the Gulf states into Gaza and then into Egypt. To Hamas, almost definitely not, of course, although Hamas is the recognized government of Gaza. To Washington and Israel through the Trump Board of Peace. To Jared Kushner, who's been involved in the talks on Iran, but also the talks on Ukraine. It appears that this 1 billion, whatever way you look at it, is effectively going to be used to bail out Israel after it has effectively decimated and destroyed Gaza. It's a bailout for Israel, in my opinion. And I would ask the question, if Russia had economically boycotted Israel from the very beginning, would it then be necessary for Russia to now contribute 1 billion to the reconstruction of Gaza?
Indeed, Vanessa. And if Russia had economically boycotted Israel from the beginning, how many other countries may have joined?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Charles, let's come back to Britain then, and the question of lithium batteries.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, I mean, lithium, of course, absolutely integral to the whole push towards all things supposedly progressive, technological, digital, but also in terms of energy, or at least what's being described as renewable energy. Now, especially in the United Kingdom, so much contingent upon the supposed requirement, or at least capability, to store energy in lithium-ion batteries. We'll just take a look at the International Energy Agency, who've put a graph out indicative of the way in which batteries are used. So this charts the last 10 years. If you can't see the graph, you'll see that the exponential rise is in large part due to the massive increase in EV car. But of course, that's not all there is. As I say, battery energy storage systems form a large part of it. Now, in terms of the sort of economic and geopolitical ramifications, the map shown on screen now indicates that outside of Australia, which of course is the leading producer of lithium, it's really China that has a grip on the lithium market and indeed the control, which is exactly what the IEA is pointing to when it talks about supply side risks. In the United Kingdom, just this week, the Energy Storage News has been talking about planning barriers threatening to stall momentum in the UK battery storage market. And as I say, this is supposedly the way in which renewable energy, or at least so-called renewable energy, is made more efficient, more effective. But there are absolutely consequences to this approach. Interesting to see how the government so adroitly dodges exactly those. This is sort of an exhibition in pointing out something in a less than straightforward manner. But we have the Battery Energy Storage Systems briefing paper, in which they say that the Faraday Institution explains that lithium-ion batteries fires are very rare. And it notes that even with billions in circulation, there are very few safety incidents involving them. And it estimates that only 1 in 40 million battery cells experience failure that results in fire. Well, that statistic may or may not be true. What they're studiously ignoring is indeed the consequences of such a fire and what can be done about it. Now, I've reported in the past about the concerns that fire brigades, fire services have had about this, and it should be absolutely newsworthy that the National Fire Chiefs Council have updated their position statement on this technology. And they recognise that the pace of change has been very substantial, and they say that this transition is outpacing safety standards and regulation, leading to potential increased fire safety risks as a result. And it's a real concern for the NFCC and fire and rescue services. Now, they use very moderate language, but it's very obvious that they are suggesting that this is being carried out in a completely irresponsible manner. And then they go on to address the environmental concerns, which they say include risk of fire and explosions, impacts on air quality because of the buildup of gases during a BESS fire, groundwater contamination from chemical leaks, and contaminated firewater runoff and noise. So, of course, I should remind you, this is the prospect of environmental catastrophe at the same time as apparently saving the environment. And they go on to say that there are a range of tactical approaches, but there is no one-size-fits-all approach to most effectively extinguish or control a fire caused by lithium-ion batteries. Now, the short version of that is they don't know how to put them out, and mostly because they can't put them out. And as reported previously, but here reinforced by Auto Evolution, an increasing number of maritime shipping companies are refusing to ship EVs, citing this fire risk. It was Matson, the Hawaii-based company that I'd reported on previously, but there are a growing number who have taken a similar line because it's just too risky because of this problem in not being able to put them out. Then we go into the air. We look at the Civil Aviation Authority in the United Kingdom with its guidance on portable electronic devices. And having, anecdotally, but having just taken a number of long-haul and short-haul flights, the increased push for attention on particularly lithium-ion battery banks and whether or not they may be carried, that they may not be carried in hold baggage, that even in the cabin they may not be used, suggests that there really is a serious concern here. And then the BBC, through gritted teeth as usual, talking about China having imposed a ban on what is described as hidden car door handles. Now, these were effectively pioneered by Tesla and obviously all about appearance rather than practicality. But should there be a problem with an EV that has door handles like this, once the power supply is shut down, if it catches fire, of course, there's no way of getting the occupant of the vehicle out. And the Chinese authorities have imposed a year-long period on that to be corrected. So absolutely, this may not be dismissed. And if you're thinking this is just a problem exclusive to China and the Chinese manufacturers, absolutely it is not. There are multiple instances of such a thing having happened in the United Kingdom. Now, referring back to the very many BESS applications, what I'd like to do is to point you towards an absolutely excellent and well-referenced letter written by Heather Godfrey, a UK column supporter, who wrote to me to get in touch about an 80 megawatt plan for a BESS installation near Crewe Cairn. And she has submitted an appeal to this. And if you have something similar going on in your area and you need specific references and a very well articulated argument, then I would like to point you towards her Substack for an idea of how to put this together and the main document. So this is now live on her Substack, and there'll be a link in the show notes.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for that. Now, let's come on to Right to Repair, and quite an interesting story coming out this week, because earlier this week, the Dutch Defense Secretary made the claim that F-35 fighter jet software could be jailbroken. This was in a statement or in a discussion he was having with the Dutch radio station, BNR News Radio. Now, this was reported in this tweet by Clash Report, and then he said, if asked whether the EU can modify F-35 software without approval, that's not the point. We'll see whether the Americans will show their true colors, he said. And then they went on to quote him as saying, I'm not going to say something I should never say, but I'll do it anyway, just like your iPhone. You can jailbreak an F-35. I won't say any more about it. Now, this raises a host of questions about nations buying warfighting equipment from other nations. And the conversation came about because of the ongoing tensions between the EU and Trump, and whether or not the US has some kind of kill switch available in the event that relations break down totally. In other words, they spend billions on F-35s and a kill switch is switched in the United States, and suddenly these aircraft turn into bricks. Now, I need to point out that there's no publicly available evidence of any such kill switch, but since nations have no access to the source code of the aircraft, there's no way to demonstrate that either way, other than to take the United States' word for it. Britain is the only country with any access at all, and then only to the parts of the code which BAE Systems wrote. Now, that may not be entirely true, though, because there's still the question of one country and whether they have special access, because questions are being asked about how Israel has apparently modded the F-35 to increase its range so that they can fly their F-35s to Iran without refueling. And this highlights, once again, the absolute reliance that European nations have on the United States for just about everything. But it also highlights an issue that we all face right down to the individual level, because this is basically the same issue that, for example, farmers have been facing with modern tractors, and the ongoing fight between farmers and John Deere tractors about whether they can repair or do anything to these vehicles themselves, despite the fact that they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on them. or that people have faced with manufacturers selling them a product and then charging a subscription to use what it is they've bought, like BMW and their heated seats scandal, but BMW doubling down on this, saying that in-car subscriptions make sense. And Charles, what we have here is, the modern expression of you will own nothing. Frankly, that policy doesn't work at any level, but because it puts us at risk as individuals, but it also puts nations at risk at the defense or warfighting level.
Yeah, well, I think that's the central point of several, and what this indicates beyond any doubt, which is absolutely the direction in which we've been warning things are going. But this is absolute proof, if it is to be demonstrated, that corporations now hold more power than states where war is concerned. So it's not going to be up to a nation as to whether they switch something on or off. It's whoever holds the proprietary technology, which of course, again, as you quite rightly point out, when you look at the British armed forces capabilities, the number of component parts that come from Israel in particular, I mean, are we to imagine that there are then going to be the possibility of sort of wrestling for control of a particular platform because of the number of competing entities that have some sort of control over it? And I think then, the other aspect, of course, is this idea that, well, if they can control it, then exactly like everything else that we talk about, which has this sort of degree of connectivity, it can be hacked. So frankly, anyone could be taking these things over. So I think there are a lot of things that do fall out of this. I think the other thing, to go back to that period of time when we were desperately getting rid of all sorts of perhaps outdated or heavy platforms that we wanted to get rid of back at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how would people have responded then if we had actually been able to say that the United Kingdom, right, well, we're going to give X number of Challenger tanks to Ukraine, but we will retain control over them? What would the response have been by the Western media to such a suggestion? So I think this does open up a number of very interesting questions, but I think essentially it points out the vulnerability of nation states and indeed the vulnerability of the technology.
Absolutely. Now, back in the UK, you were reporting on the situation with the police and Freemasonry recently. What's the update?
Yes, I was. I mean, the situation was that the Metropolitan Police, with no consultation with the United Grand Lodge of England, the sort of headshed of the Masonic setup in the United Kingdom, they went and said that a declaration must be made of membership of Freemasonry Hall, Masonic Lodge. Now, that went down very badly with the Grand Lodge, and indeed they've contested it. Of course, one of the things they objected to was having not been consulted in the first place. What it does appear, though, is that they do not understand irony, because in part of their statement, they say that the United Grand Lodge of England and others are disappointed that they do not have leave to proceed to a judicial review based on the legal arguments concerning discrimination. Of course, they seem to have misunderstood the entire point of the Metropolitan Police's edict is to prevent there being the suggestion of any positive discrimination based on membership of a Masonic lodge. They then go on to say, and an assessment of intelligence that has never been fully disclosed. Again, if there's one thing that Freemasonry is known for above all other things, it is the element of secrecy with which they operate. But again, the irony seems to have been lost on them. And then they finish off by saying, which, if communicated, could have been amicably resolved without the need for legal action. So this is basically Lord Justice Chamberlain. Interesting that it is he who has decided that this should not go to judicial review, because, of course, it was he that was set up to deal with the Palestine Action prescription, and then at the last minute was removed, having said that it would go to judicial review, and then was replaced with three other judges. I'm not suggesting there's any connection between the two things, but it is nonetheless interesting that it was he. So that's it, apparently, for now, with the Freemasons. How exactly this will play out with the Metropolitan Police will remain to be seen.
Thank you, Charles. And I just want to end then with this story from the BBC, headlined, Shop Owners Fear Violence After Paramilitaries Demand Protection Money. So this is a story from Belfast, and well, from Northern Ireland in general, because shop owners, construction firms being held to ransom by basically the same groups that were running the insurgency for 30 years from 1969. They're still there, and they're still trying to get money out of anybody that's in business over there. This has been going on from the beginning. I'll just give a quick anecdote, because in 1980, my father was working, had set up a business, had set it up in an industrial estate in South Belfast. That industrial estate was blown up after he had been in business for about a year, because the owner of the industrial estate wasn't paying the protection money. The various groupings, it didn't matter which side of the argument they were on, would get together on a regular basis with a map of Belfast and draw lines on it to decide which was their protection money area. And now, the BBC in their article is talking about the fact that the shop owners are complaining that the police won't do anything about this. And what I know from that incident in 1980 was that the police had watched that bomb being put in the car and driven down the road and left, and the police had been told to leave it alone. So there was no question that at that time, despite the fact that the IRA and the British police, or the Northern Irish police and the British military, were supposed to be on opposite sides, that there were brown envelopes being passed, and some of that protection money was going to make sure that the police did not interfere with the gathering of that protection money. It appears that that situation has not changed since, and it's surprising that the BBC is pretending in their article like this is something unusual or something that's new. So again, a little bit off the mark there with their reporting, and maybe there needs to be some kind of inquiry into why it is that this kind of activity is still going on, despite the fact that it began in the effectively 1970s. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, in extra as well. But we got to leave it there for today. So I'm going to say thank you very much to Vanessa and to Charles for your contributions, and to everybody that's been watching today. And stick around if you're a UK Column member for extra. Otherwise, we'll see you on Friday for another UK Column News at 1 p.m. as usual. See you then. Bye-bye.